I need to say, this is interesting for me to present this to people who I've cited in the book. And I have to thank you right away. If you had not published what you did, I couldn't have written this book. In fact, when I started writing it back in 2008, many of the studies that I found to be influential had not yet appeared. So my original deadline was 2010. Had I met the original deadline, I wouldn't have been able to include many of the things that we talk about. So my publisher actually said he was quite happy that I was late, which was good. So thank you. But usually I'm talking to audiences to whom I have to explain what the Late Bronze Age is. I'm presuming I don't have to do that tonight. So what I've done is actually flipped the lecture and started with all the catastrophes and all of that and used the Late Bronze Age as examples. But it's meant to be lighthearted. I do not think I'll be telling you anything you don't already know. I'll just be trying to put it into the larger context and go from there. But I also have to tell you, first of all, the title is not mine. And I fought the title the whole way through because I said 1177 is simply the 8th year of Ramses. It's when the Sea Peoples attack. It's not the year it collapsed. It took about a century. And Rob Tempio, my publisher, said, I don't care. This will sell. And I'm like, but it's false pretenses. And he said, no, something happened that year, right? I said, yeah. He said, so, when did Rome fall? I said, 476. He said, did it actually fall in 476? I said, no, there were like 5 separate invasions. It took most of the 5th century. He says, exactly. So 1177 is to the collapse of the Late Bronze Age, as 476 is to collapse of Rome. I said, okay, there's logic there. Fine. So anyway, I think this is why it sold so many, is because of the title. But also, when he first approached me, and again, this book wasn't my idea, it was Rob Tempio's. He came to me and he said, I'd like you to write a book about the collapse. And I said, well, other people have done it. I mean, Drews did it in '93. And he says, I know, we published that. He says, but it's time we updated it. And I said, well, look, I'll write the book, but I'm actually just as interested in what collapsed as why and how. So if you let me start and end the book with the collapse, and then in the middle talk about the Late Bronze Age and how globalized it was and all of that, then I'll write the book. So that's how it comes about. But he made a deal with me. He said, I'll let you do that if you let me make a book trailer. And I said, what's a book trailer? And he says, well, like when a movie is coming and they show right, you all know movie trailers, right, coming next November. He said, I want to make a book trailer. And I said, absolutely not. He says, no, take a look. It's the new thing. And I said, okay, send me a link. So he sends me a link to this guy who is on some college campus, and he's holding his book up, and he says, please buy my book. And I said, Rob, I'm not going to do that. And he says, no, I have something in mind. It's completely over the top. And so part of our agreement was that I would let him do this book trailer if I got to write the book. So, and it came out about 6 months ahead of time. I don't know if it had any impact on the sales, but it might have. I don't know. So what I would ask is, do you want me to start with the book trailer before I do the talk, or should I just do the talk? Because you're a serious audience. You might not want to see this. So I'm happy to start just with the talk. You want? In that case, all I can say is, 1, it's supposed to be over the top and tongue-in-cheek, and 2, don't blame me. Okay, you want to try it? All right, let's see if we can get it working. This will be an adventure. Okay. Having shown you that now, there's no need for me to give the lecture, so let's go to dinner. Yeah? Okay. No. All right, so you'll see it's over the top, and anyway, it was fun. Now, Princeton now makes a book trailer for every book they sell, or thereabouts. But, all right, so let me start here. We're talking about the collapse, 1200 BC. We've been talking about it all day. We'll look for it tomorrow. And one thing to keep in mind, of course, this is not the first time people have talked about collapse. And we start with, Edward Gibbon, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. We've got Tainter's book, Collapse of Complex Societies. And probably the one that most other people have heard about is Jared Diamond's book, Collapse. But the one thing these all have in common is that they're all talking about the collapse of just a single civilization, right? The Rome, Maya, Mongols, Indus Valley. What we're talking about here is the collapse of basically a globalized world. Multiple civilizations, they're all interacting, they're all at least partially dependent upon each other. And actually, there's only a few times in history when we've got something like this, when there is a globalized world system. I mean, albeit theirs is a smaller one than ours, but so the one during the Late Bronze Age and ours today, I think, are two of the most obvious examples. And I show you here, this is a diagram made by my wife who does social network analysis, and she's trying to show here the small world effect that they had in the Late Bronze Age. The thing, though, is also when this world collapsed, give or take 1200 BC, a little bit afterward, the magnitude's enormous. It is a loss like the world's not going to see again until the Roman Empire collapses about 1,500 years later. But what we are talking about is what collapsed, what caused it. And so here we are talking about climate change, and this is of great interest to people around the world. Every time one of you publishes an article like this, the popular media picks up on it. So here's one. This came out, I think, after Daphne's article. New York Times picked up on it. Pollen study points to drought as culprit in Bronze Age mystery. And then when one of the other ones came out, the LA Times picked up on it. Climate change caused demise. And then National Geographic picked up on it. Archaeology picked up on it. Everybody's going climate change, dooming everything. And even the New York Post picked up on it. And I thought, okay, that's when this is made the big time, when people are actually interested. And then there came the inevitable, the study that warned that we are going to collapse. And in this, which actually turned out to be not really a NASA-funded study, but never mind, they warned that everything was going to collapse today in just a couple of decades, and the blogs picked up on it, and on and on and on. But here, too, the author only cited single civilizations. And so I felt the need to write a blog post on the Huffington Post and called it The Collapse of Civilizations. It's complicated. All right. So, and in fact, it was. He had simplified it too much. So, now this is where we stand today. Now, let me take you back a bit. The original hypothesis, as some or most or all of you know, is that it was the Sea Peoples that caused the collapse. And they come through in 1207 and 1177, if you accept those dates. We're safer saying the 5th year of Merneptah and the 8th year of Ramses III. In fact, I'll let you in on a secret. The original title of the book was 1186. And while I was writing it, the Egyptologists changed the chronology, and boom, 1177. So I actually got an email after it came out from an unknown person who many of you know, who simply said, it should have been 1186. And I wrote back, it was. So bear with me. Anyway, so the Sea Peoples were the original claim, the boogeyman. We've got this from the wall relief at Medinet Habu as well as other places. But it was formulated by, among others, Maspero, one of the early French Egyptologists. And he had formulated this already back 1860s, 1870s. By 1901, it was solidified that the Sea Peoples had caused this. And this is even before many of the sites had been excavated that were destroyed. So thereafter, anytime something was excavated where there was a destruction level, they said it was the Sea Peoples. And this is where I started thinking there's been too much attached to them. It's too easy to blame them. They've been, this boogeyman, right? Go to sleep now or the sea peoples will get you, right? But they've then presented in popular literature. By the way, I don't know if you celebrate Halloween over here, but we're getting ready for Halloween, right? If you want a cheap and easy Halloween costume, you can go dressed as a sea person. You don't actually have to put on any of the headdresses or anything. Just cut out the letter C and put it all over your body, right? Like 50 or 100 of them, and then you'll be sea peoples. It works. In graduate school, 2 of my friends won a contest dressed as sea peoples that way. So here we have, among a number of inscriptions, we've got Ramses III from year 8. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. And then he tells us where they came through, right? Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Artsua, Alasia. Basically Turkey, Cyprus, Syria. They came through Amor. And then he even tells us who they are. Peleset, Tajakar, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh. Now bear in mind, this is the second group that came through, right? The first group came through 30 years earlier. But he also, Ramses and Merneptah never call them the sea peoples. They talk about them coming from the north. They talk about them being from various places, but they don't actually call them the sea peoples. This is Maspero and others that give them that name. But we've got the pictures. We know what they look like. So if you actually want to dress for Halloween legitimately, you could dress like this. But the problem is we don't know where they come from, honestly, and we don't know where they go to. There was a theory that they came from west and went east. There's also a theory they come from the east and go west. It goes either way. And most people trying to figure out where these guys come from are playing linguistic games. So Sardana, some people say they're from Sardinia or that they went to Sardinia afterward. Shekelesh, maybe Sicily, but you note the question marks. I'm not at all sure. Tajakar, who knows? Maybe the Sickles, maybe somewhere in the Troad. Denyen, people like to connect these with Homer's Mycenaeans, but who knows? Weshesh, or particularly shadowy, maybe they're from Wilusa, that is Troy, but not sure. The one thing everybody likes is that the Peleset are the Philistines. And even this is not for sure, but it does make a certain amount of sense. And in fact, the Bible does say that the Philistines come from Crete. So maybe this actually does work. And so we are finding evidence of Philistines, of course, up and down the coast of Israel and Lebanon and Syria. And I show you just a couple here. Now, one thing, though, about the inscriptions that Ramses shows us is that it's not just the land and the sea battle. It's not just a raid of Vikings. It's a migration. And you've got ox carts with women and children. So this is a mass migration. They are moving because they have to, not because they're out for, just spoil and plunder. So it used to be, in particular, people said, well, there was a drought. It caused famine. That started them moving. Then when they moved, they caused havoc and cutting of the trade routes, and that led to collapse. And it was all this nice, linear, one thing leads to another. But I would argue that this is way too simple. I think it really isn't. And so one of the things that I wanted to explore is what really happened. And that's where I needed all of the work of all of you to figure that out. I'm definitely leaning on all of you and sitting on your shoulders. And so what I would argue is that we've got a globalized society, and part of what I'll show tonight is that everyone is interconnected. And for most of the late Bronze Age, they're happily interacting with each other with diplomacy and reciprocity and trade going back and forth, and they're marrying each other's daughters, and everybody's happy. And then we've got a number of things that happen. And so I think it's a messy collapse. And Daphne alluded to this in her talk earlier. There's a lot going on here. I think we've got not just one driving force. I think we've got a bunch. We've got a lot of triggers. There's invaders for sure. I think there's drought. We've been seeing that today. And with the drought comes famine. But I also think there are earthquakes and that there are rebellions. And so it's not linear at all. It's extremely messy, as most collapses actually are when you take a look at them. And the other thing to remember, that in a globalized society, which I would say they were back then, they're all interdependent, that change to one potentially could destabilize them all. It doesn't have to, but it might. So if something happens to the Mycenaeans, that could then affect the Hittites, which could then affect the Egyptians, and it could be like dominoes. So it doesn't mean it does, but it could. So if we take our globalized society and into it we drop a little chaos, then what happens is, one by one, they all start going away until we're left only with Egypt. And even Egypt is so weakened that it's never the same again, right? It never sees another real high point after the New Kingdom. So if everything's gone, basically, at least for a little while, then what caused it? And this is, again, what we've been talking about here. So the Sea Peoples, as I said, were originally blamed, but I think there are other people in it as well. And we've got evidence for droughts and famine and invaders and earthquakes. So I thought I'd run through these very quickly. It's preaching to the choir, I know, but let me show you what we've got here. So, and you will recognize, some of you, your own work here. In terms of drought, we start with Kaniuski's work in 2011. He's over in Syria, and he comes up with he and his team, the 300-year dry event, where you've got pollen from the alluvial deposits, and basically says that we've got these drier climatic conditions from the late 13th or early 12th centuries right down to the 9th century. And then continued the work over in Cyprus at Hala Sultan Tekke, published in 2013. Major environmental changes took place in this area during the period from 1200 to 850 BC, turned into a drier landscape, unable to sustain agriculture, and so on and so forth. And then at the same time, we've got Brandon Lee Drake coming out in 2012 with at least 3 additional lines of evidence, all suggesting that the early Iron Age was more arid than the Bronze Age had been, including a drop in the temperature of the surface of the sea, whether it's evaporation or precipitation, and that the change probably occurred before 1250 or 1197, which works very nicely into this. And then we've got Daphne's work with Israel Finkelstein and Thomas Litt coming out in 2013, where they looked at the fossil pollen particles from the bottom of the Sea of Galilee and the western shore of the Dead Sea, which we heard about earlier today, indicating that severe drought started by about 1250, but is already over by about 1100. So with the drought comes famine. Now, here we've got the textual evidence. This is where the literary texts come in. Here's a letter from the house of Ortenu at Ugarit on the north coast of Syria. It's talking about famine that's ravaging the city of Emar in inland Syria, about 1185. And I quote, "There is famine in our house. We will all die of hunger. If you do not quickly arrive here, we ourselves will die of hunger. You will not see a living soul from your land." End quote. I think that's pretty good evidence that there was famine at that time, all right? But just in case, here's a letter from the king of Ugarit to an unnamed correspondent, probably senior, probably royal. "Here with me, plenty has become famine." So Emar's got famine, Ugarit's got famine. Even the Hittites have famine. Here's snippets from 2 separate letters. "Do you not know that there was a famine in the midst of my lands? And it is a matter of life and death." So pretty much everybody is suffering from famine. Now, it doesn't mean that follows from drought, but it's definitely a likely culprit. So at the same time, we've got possible invaders, we've got possible internal rebellion, and here I would point to the very well-known letter from Ugarit being sent to the king of Cyprus. "My father, now the ships of the enemy have come. They've been setting fire to my cities, have done harm to the land. Doesn't my father know that all the infantry and chariotry are stationed in Hatti, up in Turkey? All of my ships are stationed in the land of Luca, also Turkey. They've not arrived back yet, so the land is thus prostrate. May my father be aware of this matter. Now the 7 ships of the enemy which have been coming have done harm to us. If other ships of the enemy turn up, send me a report somehow so that I will know." Now this was originally reported as having been found in a kiln in the city of Ugarit, being baked before it had been sent. And what I was taught as both an undergraduate and a graduate was that invaders had hit the city of Ugarit before it could be finished being baked, and so it was never sent. Well, recent restudy, of course, has overturned that, and now we're told that this was actually originally in a basket up on the second floor, fell off the second floor, overturned, and so what looked like a kiln was actually the remnants of the basket, and there's about 70 tablets that were in that basket. So what that means is this, if this is a copy, it may well have, the original might have been sent, but it also means we don't actually know if this is referring to the 1177 invasion or to the 1207 invasion. It could be either if we don't have that context of a kiln. Still, it's rather important to show you that there are invaders, even if they are unnamed. There's another letter, a private letter. It's one of the last that comes from Ugarit. When your messenger arrived, the army was already humiliated, and the city was sacked. Our food and the threshing floors was burnt. The vineyards were also destroyed. Our city is sacked. May you know it. May you know it. So again, I would argue that this is pretty good evidence that there is invaders of some sort, however far they come away from. So Kaniuski, back at Gibala, where they had done the pollen analysis, they published the results of the excavation here. I think they went a little far based on the evidence. This is where they dated it to 1192 to 1190, which is probably a little too specific. And they also specifically claimed they had found sea people's evidence. I'm, let's see, a little less sure than they are. There may well be sea peoples there, but the question is, even if this is Philistine or sea people's material, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the ones that destroyed the site. It simply means that they occupied it after the destruction. The two may be the same, but they might not be. So I would not be in quite such a rush to say we finally found evidence of sea peoples, though this may be one of the best that we've got so far. But I would put out as a warning what we have from Canaanite Hazor, where we know that the late Bronze Age palace is destroyed somewhere around 1250 or a little bit thereafter. We've got the mud bricks that are completely burnt. There's absolutely no question it's destroyed. But by whom? Egyptians, Canaanites, Israelites, sea peoples, internal rebellion. One of the two co-directors, Amnon ben Tor, wants it to be Israelites. He rules out Egyptians and Canaanites and sea peoples, and he's left with Israelites. But the other co-director, Sharon Zuckerman, says no, it's just as likely to be internal rebellion, and points out that it's the palace and the temple that are burnt, but the rest of it is untouched, basically, which to her argues for an internal rebellion like we might have at Mycenae or somewhere else. So if the two co-directors of Hazor can't decide who destroyed their own site, I'm not sure that the rest of us can. So I hold that out as just an item to consider. But I would also bring in the fact that there are earthquakes at this time. And again, we've heard this earlier today, and it's something that I and Amos Noor have worked on. There are a number of evidences that there are earthquakes at this time. This is a map that comes originally based on Druze that was then redone for an article. And you can see here most, if not all, of the major sites that are destroyed in the 50-year period between 1225 and 1175. And if you look at the same type of area and instead plot on it the earthquakes that have happened in roughly the last century, from 1900 to 1980, and of course if you have earthquakes in that area now, you had them back then as well, you notice that many of the sites that are destroyed are in active fault zones, in active seismic areas. And so I'm wondering if some of the sites that are destroyed by Mother Nature, if not by human agency. And it can be very hard to tell. Unless you have arrowheads and swords in the destruction, you're not always sure what's caused it. And indeed, there are a number of fault lines that go through the area. You see coming across Turkey, the North Anatolian fault line, and others in Greece, and then, of course, the big one going right up through the Rift Valley and the Dead Sea area. And here, showing you the North Anatolian fault line, one thing that was intriguing to me is this idea of an earthquake storm. It's frequently called an earthquake sequence when you talk about modern earthquakes, but Amos Noor dubbed it an earthquake storm in antiquity. And what happens that if you have an earthquake that doesn't release all of the stress in the fault line, you will frequently have another earthquake right next to it sometime later. It could be weeks, it could be decades, it could be years, but you will have another earthquake nearby. And if that doesn't release all of the stress, you'll then have another one and another one. And basically the fault line, like this one, will unzip its entire length, and it can take up to 50 years. And what you see here are the plots of the earthquakes that have taken place, 1966, 1949, 1971, and you'll recall the ones that were fairly recently, 97, 98, 99 in Istanbul and those regions. So the idea was that if we have this now, they may have had it back then. And so we're wondering, Claude Schaeffer, way back when, suggested that an earthquake had destroyed everything. And the problem is it can't be just one earthquake if it's a 50-year period. But what if it's a series of earthquakes all related this way? So we thought this was kind of interesting, started looking for the evidence. And here you have, and we've seen this picture earlier, we actually have Mycenae built on an active fault line. If you look on the left there, you see the sloping rock underneath the Cyclopean masonry. That is, it's a natural fault scarp. It's like one side of an earthquake zone. So the Mycenaeans built their city right on top of an active earthquake zone. And at first I looked at this and I said, my goodness, how could they have been so silly? Why would you do, oh wait, San Francisco is kind of like that too, isn't it? All right, so it happens. All right, so at Mycenae, we've got evidence for earthquakes. Here is a skeleton of a young lady. It's actually the same skeleton in both pictures. The rock you see in the right-hand picture was originally on her head. That's what killed her when it fell. And for those of you who know it, the woman excavating on the left, that's Noni Milanos, when she was a young lady excavating at Mycenae. And we've also got at Tiryns a number of bodies. There's a woman and a child underneath the fallen wall. And, of course, Troy 6, destroyed by an earthquake. Last time I checked, the walls were not supposed to look like that when they were actually standing, but you notice how tilted they are there, right? And we heard about that earlier today also with the earthquake at Troy 6. And then back to Ugarit, which is a slightly earlier earthquake here, but you notice the blocks that are out of alignment. That wall was not supposed to look like that originally. So there are definitely earthquakes at that time. I'm not saying that they ended the Late Bronze Age. I'm saying that they may have contributed to the end of the Late Bronze Age. But same thing with the cutting of the international trade routes, which I think definitely happened at this time. If we start plotting the major powers of the ancient Near East, at this time, and actually this map is not quite done. I've got a graduate student working on it. He hasn't put in the routes up to Hattusas, and I emailed him and said, you got Assur on there, but you left out the Assyrians, so we need to add to this. But here we've got evidence again from the literature. It goes all the way back to the 18th century with the Mari letters. And here I show you it's actually illustrated with one of the daggers from the death pits at Ur, but you get the idea. They mention one Kaftorian weapon. Of course, Kaftor is what they called Crete. The top and the base are covered with gold. Its top is encrusted with lapis lazuli. Now, I don't know about you, but I want one of these. I would love to walk around, but I'm probably not going to get one, so never mind. But my favorite is the one letter that translated says one pair of leather shoes. I'm assuming they're sandals like this, in the Kaftorian style, so they're Minoan shoes, which to the palace of Hammurabi, king of Babylon, Bakhdi Lim carried, but which were returned. Now this is the famous Hammurabi, right? Law code, eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And why he returned them is not told to us. I don't know. Are they too small? Did he not like the style? Was it too last millennium? One never knows. But I wonder why he didn't keep them. I would at least have re-gifted them. I mean, they're from Crete. They have distance value, but no. I did go through the law code again, and I looked, and there's no penalty for returning shoes. So he was able to get away with it. Right, but this is evidence already by the 18th century of some of the long-distance trade that's going around. And we've got others too. I could go on for hours, but I would keep you from your food and drink, so I won't. But just show you a couple of examples. We know Hatshepsut sends an expedition or embassy down to Punt. She's not the first, and she won't be the last. There are a number that do this. The big question, even though we've got pictures, including Eti, the queen of Punt, the big question was, where is Punt located? But recently, they just did some analyses of baboon mummies and have decided that it is in the region of Ethiopia or Eritrea, which makes sense. That was one of the prime possibilities. We've also got tomb paintings from the time of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, famous tomb of Rekhmire, which is showing Aegean peoples bringing goods. They're definitely Aegean-style goods that they're carrying. Same thing with a number of other tombs. Two, you don't get a bull's head like that being brought to you unless they're coming from the Aegean for the most part. And then probably my favorite of all, the statue-based list of Amenhotep III, who would be ruling just before the wet period of 1350 BC when they're taking advantage of all of this. And in his mortuary temple, there's a number of these over life-size statue bases. There would have been a statue probably about 10 feet high. And on each of the bases, they have engraved lists of places known to the Egyptians. These were first found, I've got a picture from 1975 or so, but the more recent excavations there are finding more. I think they're up to almost 40 of these statue-based lists. But for me, the most important one, of course, is the Aegean list, which on this list there are names that, for the most part, are never seen before and never will be again. The two on the right side are Keftiu and Tanaya, Keftiu being the Egyptian name for Crete, and Tanaya, I think, being their name for mainland Greece, though you can put it any number of other places if you want to. And these I see as the titles for the list. There are some 14 other names that go around for you, the left side of the base here. And even though each of these names is written as a bound prisoner, that's okay. It's an iconographic convention for depicting a foreigner at that time. I don't know if it means they wanted to dominate them, but they didn't actually. So the names, the other names, you've got Amnisos, Festos, Kydonia, Mycenae, Dicte, which could be Boeotian Thebes, Katazaku, or maybe somewhere else, Methana, which might be in the Argolid, or maybe Masana, Naphthion for sure, Kithra, Ilios or Elia. I think Ilios is out of favor these days. Elia on Crete is more favored. Knossos, Amnisos again, and then Lyktos. And this was published first by Kitchen back in 1965, and he had a wonderful article in which he said, I hardly dare suggest, but, and then he said, here's Mycenae and Knossos, and it was pretty obvious he was correct. But the question is, what is this? And I would argue that it is, in fact, not just a list of place names, but might actually be a geographical itinerary of a voyage that was, or voyages that were taken, because at Mycenae we find fragments of at least 10 plaques with Amenhotep's name on both sides of them. And these are the only place at Mycenae that they're found anywhere outside of Egypt. So this is unique. But we do have a number of other objects of both Amenhotep III and his wife Queen T at places like Knossos. Overall, there's a number of the sites that are on the statue-based list also have objects of he or his wife. And I think that's not just a coincidence. So I was playing around with it, and I tried to figure out if there were a geographical list, what would it look like? I came up with something like this, where they're sailing from Egypt up to Crete. They stop at Amnisos first. That's where you're going to replenish your food and your water and use the bathroom. Then you go around via Kythera over to mainland Greece. Basically, you're visiting your old friends, the Minoans, and then this new rising power, the Mycenaeans, who have been around for just a little bit, really, on the international scene at this point. And then you come back to Crete, and basically almost the last thing you do is stop at Amnisos again to get your food, water, and say, okay, kids, use the bathroom now, or hold it till we get back to Egypt. All right? It's just like driving on the New Jersey Turnpike or wherever. Same thing today. So I think this is more than just a list of random names, but then again, I'm kind of a maximalist and a romantic, so I want it to be like this. But I don't know. Be the first to admit the data doesn't support it, but it's a possibility. And we've also, though, we've got textual evidence that things like this are taking place. Here's the Sinoranu text, dates to about 1260 BC. It's from the king of Ugarit, and he says, from the present day, Amastamru, son of Nikmepa, king of Ugarit, exempts Sinoranu, son of Siginu. His grain, his beer, his olive oil to the palace he shall not deliver. His ship is exempt when it arrives from Crete. So this guy, Sinoranu, a merchant, is sending his ship from the coast of North Syria over to Crete and bringing back grain and beer and olive oil in the 13th century. And then what I like is he's exempt. I think this may be the first corporate tax exemption in history, right? But he doesn't have to pay taxes. And then, of course, as the demonstration, we have the UCLouvain shipwreck, which sank about 40 years before that in 1300 BC. With this audience, I don't have to go into detail on it, but just show you what they're finding, or what they found, George Bass and Jamal Pulik, with stone anchors and 300 ingots of copper. You can see Nicole Hirschfeld walking there with one of the 100. Got about 10 minutes left. That's my alarm. Walking with one of the 140 Canaanite jars, and we've also got on board the tin ingots and the glass ingots, plus terebinth resin, ivory, and unused Syrian, Cypriot, Canaanite pottery as well. And the question with this ship is, which way is it going? This is what Bass thought back in 1987. It was going round and round. I'm not at all sure this is what it's doing. It may be a gift from one king to another. It has yet to be settled. But it is evidence of late Bronze Age trade. And we have an Amarna letter, which is discussing a shipment of 200 talents of copper. If, as has been suggested, those oxide ingots are a talent, we've got 300 talents on the UCLouvain ship. So we have something like this. Now, I actually think that making the bronze is very symptomatic of the international connections at this time. Right? The copper, of course, is coming from Cyprus, almost without a doubt. But the tin, even though there is some in southeastern Turkey, and you could go up to Cornwall if you wanted to, the vast majority is coming from off this map in Afghanistan. That is the Badakhshan region, where you get lapis lazuli also. And in fact, we have a Mari letter that tells us that you've got people from Crete lining up to get it. So 1 1/3 mina of tin to the Kaftorian, 1/3 of a mina of tin to the interpreter of the chief merchant of the Kaftorians in Ugarit. So this means you've got your tin going from Afghanistan to Mari, from Mari to Ugarit, and from Ugarit to Crete. And if that's not long-distance trade, I don't know what is. And if you cut that trade route at any point, you're in trouble, because you've got 90% copper, 10% tin to make your bronze. If you don't have your tin anymore, then you're literally up the creek. And in fact, that's what Carol Bell pointed out over in England, and she wrote, the strategic importance of tin in the late Bronze Age was probably not far different from that of crude oil today. The availability of enough tin to produce weapons-grade bronze must have exercised the minds of the great king in Hattusas and the pharaoh in Thebes in the same way that supplying gasoline to the American SUV driver at reasonable cost preoccupies an American president today. So think tin, think oil, same type of idea. So in summing up, I think I can say a couple of things that we will not argue with. First of all, we've got a number of separate civilizations that are flourishing from the 15th to the 13th centuries. I think we'll all agree on that, right? These include the Hittites, Egyptians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Canaanites, and Cypriots, and that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This is the G8 of the late Bronze Age, all right? They're each independent, consistently interacted with each other, especially through the trade routes, and I think I can say that without fear of contradiction. I can also say that it's clear that many of the cities are destroyed, and that life as they knew it pretty much ended in about 1177 or soon thereafter. Again, no argument there. And I would say that there's actually been no unequivocal proof offered as to who or what caused it, which resulted in the collapse. There's a lot of suggestions, but no definitive proof. So there are, though, still publications coming out that suggest a linear progression. We still get people saying drought, famine, movement of sea peoples, havoc, collapse. And that's just not the case. And it was much more messy. And I was very pleased to see Daphne's slide earlier today, which showed just how messy it was. So if you remember our happily functioning gears and cogs here, dropping a little bit of chaos in there, and one by one, they all go away. I think you will agree that this is the situation that we've got. But I have to ask, how could any of this have ended? I mean, everything ended, basically, at least for a while, from Italy to Mesopotamia and from Egypt up to Turkey. And this surprises me because people survive earthquakes all the time. Yeah, you have dead people, but people survive. People survive droughts. People survive famines. Look at the Dust Bowl in the 1930s in America. All right, people survive invasions. You don't have your civilization collapse because of one of those, at least not usually. But what if you had more than just one? What if you survived one or even two of these, but you had three or more? What if you had drought, famine, and invaders, or drought, famine, invaders, and earthquakes? And what happens if they all happen at the same time or in quick succession? Then we get this multiplier effect where you could survive one but not two, or one and two but not three. So I think maybe that this is what we should be looking at. So I don't think that there was a single driving force or a trigger. There might have been a prime mover, and I would probably say climate change would be the prime one, but there isn't just one. You've got drought, you've got famine, you've got earthquakes, you've got invaders, you've got rebellions, and each of these force the people living in the different areas to react in different ways. Right? And we heard that earlier today, that something that happens might affect you in Turkey differently than it affects you in Greece. You've got these different things, and people accommodate in different ways. And also, if they really were as interconnected as I think they were, then again, I come back to my point that if there's a change to one, like the Mycenaeans or the Hittites, it could affect and destabilize them all. And we're moving into the realm of chaos theory and other things here. In fact, what we're really looking at is systems collapse. And Colin Renfrew talked about this way back in 1979. He said, these are the features of systems collapse. Central administration, organization goes away, traditional elite class goes away, centralized economy goes away, so they have settlement shifts, they have population decline, and we've got all that in the years after 1200. So we're looking at a systems collapse, however it was caused. And so here, again, these are the definitions for Renfrew, and I realize it's too small, you probably can't see it. So he said it might take as much as a century for all aspects of the collapse to be completed. There's usually no single obvious cause for the collapse. In the aftermath, there's frequently a transition to a lower level of socio-political integration and development of a romantic Dark Age myth about the previous period, right? Think Homer and the Trojan War. And I would say not only does this fit the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean right after 1200, it also describes the Maya, Old Kingdom Egypt, the Indus Valley, Roman Empire at various different times. So what lessons can we learn? What lessons can we learn in ancient history? I'm always trying to make things relevant to my students. So what about here? Well, first and foremost, empires have risen and fallen, right? We don't have the Sumerians around anymore. Akkadians are gone, Assyrians, Babylonians, Hittites, all these people are gone. They rise and they fall. So I think we really do need to pay attention to what's happened to previous people and not think that we're invulnerable. An awful lot of people think, oh, it couldn't happen to us. In fact, I think we're probably more susceptible than we might wish to think. So I would ask you one question. Today, do you think we're facing a similar situation to that they faced in 1177? And I give you the following. Climate change, back then and now, I would argue yes. Famines and droughts, back then, I would say yes and yes. Earthquakes and tsunamis, yes. Rebellions, yes. The only thing missing from today are the sea peoples. Mysterious invaders, and yet, it's been suggested to me that ISIL, who are currently overrunning much of Syria and Iraq, may be our version of the sea peoples, in which case, we've got everything. So, recently, in the last year or two, the news from the Mediterranean, Greece's economy's tanked, all right? Internal rebellions have engulfed Libya, Egypt, and Syria. Outsiders and foreign warriors have fanned the flames. Turkey fears it's going to be involved. Israel's afraid it's going to be pulled in. Jordan's crowded with refugees. All right, all sound familiar? These are all ripped from the headlines of the last year or two. And Iran is bellicose and threatening, Iraq's in turmoil. Now, what about the ancient news from 1200 BC? Yep, same thing. Absolutely the same thing. So, what I would argue, today we are obviously much more technologically advanced than they were back then, but it doesn't mean we are immune. It happened 3,000 years ago. It could happen again today if we don't take steps to avoid it. The question, of course, is what steps would those be? Fortunately, as an ancient historian, I look back. I'm going to leave it to others to look forward. What I would say, though, is since every cloud does have a silver lining, I would point out that because the Bronze Age civilizations did come to an end, new peoples and new city-states like Israelites, Aramaeans, and Phoenicians were able to establish themselves in the Eastern Mediterranean. And from them came things that we're still using today: the alphabet, monotheistic religion. In fact, you could argue Western civilization has its real beginnings after the Bronze Age collapses. So, out with the old, in with the new, and I would simply point out that it sometimes takes a large-scale wildfire to help renew the ecosystem of an old-growth forest and allow it to thrive afresh. Sometimes it's not so bad. Thanks.